This video focuses on the three types of t-test in more detail. To test whether UB Dental students' average debt is different from the national average, the researcher would need to have a reported value for the national debt. The American Dental Education Association tracks this information through its survey of dental school seniors. And last year, the average debt for all graduating students was $256,000. The mean for a sample of UB Dental students would then be compared to this value. The test is called a one-sample t-test because it involves data from one sample. The null hypothesis is that the mean student debt of UB Dental graduates is equal to the national mean, or $256,000. Suppose that the researcher believes that student debt will be higher among UB Dental graduates. The research hypothesis would be directional, or one-tailed, because she is stating a direction for the expected difference from the national average. She collects her data, calculates a sample mean, and uses the one-sample t-test to determine whether to reject the null hypothesis. Here are how her results might be reported. She found no statistically significant difference between her sample mean and the national average, which means that the null hypothesis was not rejected. The decision was made on the basis of the statistics reported at the end of this sentence. So let's look at this information more closely. The letter T indicates that this was a t-test. Next is a number that represents the degrees of freedom for the test. The degrees of freedom is related to sample size. For a one-sample t-test, the degrees of freedom is equal to the number of subjects minus 1. In this case, the sample size is 50. The next reported value is the calculated test statistic, the value for t based on the data. The last number is the p-value, the likelihood of getting similar results when the null hypothesis is true. If this number is small, generally less than 0.05, the researcher rejects the null hypothesis. In this case, the number is larger than 0.05, so the null hypothesis is not rejected. Here is the distribution of all possible values for t when the null hypothesis is true, showing where the calculated test statistic of 1.19 falls. The p-value is the area beyond this value. For the bond strength example, the researcher is testing two different cementing agents, and the test is called an independent t-test. The null hypothesis is that the two means are equal. The researcher has no prior information to suggest that one cementing agent would be stronger than the other, so the research hypothesis would be non-directional or two-tailed, that the means are not equal, or that the difference is not equal to 0. The researcher tests the bond strength of teeth bonded with one of the two cementing agents and calculates the mean bond strength for each group. He then compares the means using the independent t-test. This is how the results might be reported. The mean bond strength of SB was significantly higher than that of Z', which means that the null hypothesis was rejected. For an independent t-test, the degrees of freedom is equal to the number of subjects minus 2. The degrees of freedom is 28, so the sample size is 30. The calculated test statistic value is 3.34. The p-value is very small, which is why the researcher rejected the null hypothesis. This is the distribution of all possible values for t when the null hypothesis is true. Because this was a two-tailed test, the rejection region, and therefore the p-value, is divided evenly into both tails. For the orthodontic treatment example, there are two means, before and after, but these means come from the same subjects. The test of related means is called a paired t-test. The null hypothesis states that there is no difference in mean inclination before and after treatment, that the means are equal. Because the researcher expects treatment to align the teeth, his research hypothesis is directional, or one-tailed. The mean inclination is higher before than after treatment, or the mean difference is greater than 0. The mean inclination was significantly higher before than after treatment, so the null hypothesis was rejected. The degrees of freedom for a paired t-test is the same as for a one-sample t-test, n-1, so the sample size is 15. The calculated test statistic value is 2.45. The p-value is small, that is, less than 0.05, which tells us that the researcher rejected the null hypothesis. This was a one-tailed test, so the entire rejection region is in the upper tail, and 0.014 is the area beyond the calculated test statistic value. To summarize, t-tests involve mean comparisons. Specifically, they are used when comparing one sample mean to a known standard, as in the student debt example, when comparing two unrelated means, as in the dental cements example, and when comparing two related means, as in the effect of orthodontic treatment on mesiodistal inclination. In the next and last video in this series, we'll look at the analysis of variance procedure.